Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving into the world of autonomous vehicles today. It's going to be a fascinating one. Going beyond just the cool factor of self-driving cars, we're really going to look at the potential impacts using this research paper as our guide. It's called Autonomous Vehicles, Freedom, Control, and the Ethics of Automation.
Yeah, it's a really interesting paper because it gets at something kind of fundamental.
Hmm.
This isn't just about cars that drive themselves. This is about how our idea of freedom might change when we're not the ones behind the wheel.
So like imagine a world where you never have to circle the block looking for a parking spot ever again.
Right.
Your AV drops you at the door, finds parking on its own, maybe even run some errands while you're at work.
Sure, yeah, that's convenient, but the paper pushes us to think, is that really freedom? Or
Right.
is it just a different kind of reliance,
Well,
right? We're handing over control to an algorithm, becoming dependent on these complex systems that, honestly, most of us don't really understand.
yeah, it's like trading the stress of driving for a whole other set of questions about who's really in control.
Yeah.
What about the data these AVs are going to collect? Our movements, habits, destinations. It's a
Right.
goldmine of information about us.
Absolutely. The paper highlights this tension between convenience and privacy. Take someone with limited mobility, for example. An AV could give them a level of independence they haven't had before, but at the same time, their every move is tracked and logged. Who has access to that data?
So there are these huge potential benefits for some people, but the privacy implications are something we all need to consider. But let's get into the tech side a little bit. How do these things actually work? Making decisions on the fly in traffic seems mind-bogglingly complex.
It is. The paper doesn't dive deep into the technical specifics, but we can talk about some key concepts. AVs use a bunch of sensors like cameras and radar and LiDAR to understand their surroundings. That data gets fed into super sophisticated algorithms. Basically, teaching a computer to drive by showing it tons and tons of real-world driving data.
So it's not just pre-programmed rules. It's a system that learns and adapts as it encounters new situations. That's pretty wild. But, okay, what happens in those tricky situations where there's no easy answer? Like, what if an accident is unavoidable?
That's where the ethics get really thorny. The paper uses this thought experiment called the trolley problem to illustrate the challenge. Imagine an AV has to choose swerve to avoid a pedestrian, but maybe endanger its passenger, or stay the course and potentially harm the pedestrian.
That's, wow, the tough thought experiment. But the paper makes it clear this isn't just hypothetical. AVs will have to make those choices, split-second decisions with real consequences. So how do we program a machine to make those kinds of judgments?
That's the million-dollar question. One idea the paper explores is embedding ethical frameworks into the algorithms. But even then, whose ethics do we use? The programmers, the car manufacturers, society as a whole.
And then there's the question of, do we give humans the ability to override the AV's decisions? Because if we do, isn't that kind of defeating the purpose of having a fully autonomous system? You're reintroducing human error.
Absolutely a crucial question. The paper really stresses the need to figure out those roles and responsibilities when it comes to human oversight. Can passengers intervene in critical situations, or do we trust the system completely?
It's like we're trying to create these perfect ethical machines, but we're still dealing with our own human imperfections.
Yeah.
And then you have the real-world challenges of, you know, sensor reliability, unexpected circumstances.
Totally. And the paper actually brings up the Uber AV fatality that happened in Arizona a few years back. It's a stark reminder that these systems aren't perfect. Sensors can fail, and the role of human oversight is still really complex.
It's a sobering reminder that accidents can happen, even with all this advanced tech. The consequences can be serious. So how do we balance the potential benefits of AVs with this need for safety and accountability?
Well, that's where regulation comes in. The paper looks at how different parts of the world are trying to create rules for a technology that's still evolving so rapidly.
It's definitely a moving target.
Yeah.
What are some of the key differences in how countries are approaching this?
You see, the EU is leaning towards stricter regulation, really emphasizing data privacy and ethical considerations, kind of like they did with GDPR. They want a lot of transparency and accountability from AV developers.
But here in the US, it seems like we're taking a more fragmented approach, right? State by state. Could that be a problem?
Yeah, it could. Imagine an AV designed for California's rules suddenly having to navigate Nevada's roads, which might have totally different regulations. It raises this need for global standards, not just for safety, but for the sake of innovation, too.
So it's like trying to create a universal language for autonomous driving. one that everyone can understand and agree on.
Exactly. We've got this incredibly powerful technology with huge potential upsides. But the challenges are massive too. The ethics, the regulations, establishing global standards. Where do we even go from here? It's a big question.
It is. The paper doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but it really emphasizes the need for ongoing dialogue and collaboration. This isn't just about engineers and policymakers. This is about all of us figuring this out together.
It's not just about the tech, it's about how we as a society want to use it and shape it.
Exactly. Which brings us to the big question. Are we really ready to hand over the wheel?
That's a question we'll keep exploring as we go deeper into this topic. But for now, we'll leave you with that thought.
Yeah, ready or not, it's coming fast. But are we really prepared for how AVs could change society as a whole?
That's a really good point. We've talked about the individual level, but what about the bigger picture? Like, what happens to all the people whose jobs depend on driving?
It's a huge question. The paper acknowledges that. Job displacement is a real concern. Truck drivers, taxi drivers, delivery drivers, whole industries could be transformed. We could be looking at some major economic shifts. It's like we're on the cusp of this technological revolution. But we have to make sure it doesn't leave a bunch of people behind. Are there ways to, soften the blow?
The paper talks about retraining programs, helping people develop skills for the new jobs that AV tech will create, and also things like social safety nets to support people while they transition to new careers.
Making sure the benefits are shared.
Right.
Not just concentrated in the hands of a few. And what about our cities? How will AVs change urban planning?
The paper gets into that too. It's fascinating. Think about it. Less need for parking could free up tons of space in cities. We could have more green spaces, more pedestrian areas, even totally new urban designs built around AVs.
Hit the reset button on how we think about cities. Instead of concrete and parking lots, more vibrant, human-centered spaces. But couldn't this lead to more sprawl, too? If commuting is easier and cheaper with AVs, wouldn't people just move further out?
It's a valid point. The paper suggests using urban planning to manage that. Things like incentives for denser housing near AV hubs, or really good public transportation systems that work alongside AV networks. Thinking ahead and being proactive about how the landscape changes.
So we're not just letting the tech dictate how things unfold. We can use it as a tool to create the kind of cities we want to live in. Speaking of shaping the future, what about the environment? What kind of impact will AVs have there?
It's a bit of a mixed bag. The paper points out that AVs could be more fuel efficient because of smoother acceleration and better routes, but there's also a chance they could lead to people driving more miles overall, since it's easier and cheaper to commute. Imagine empty AVs just circling around waiting for their next ride.
Yeah, the convenience could backfire. More congestion, and maybe we end up worse off environmentally. We need to find ways to encourage ride-sharing and discourage those unnecessary trips.
Exactly. Policies that encourage sustainable use are key. The paper talks about things like congestion pricing or incentives for ride sharing. It's about using the tech responsibly.
So we've touched on some pretty big potential shifts here. Jobs, urban sprawl, the environment, lots of unknowns. How do we deal with that uncertainty and make sure we're headed in the right direction?
One really important point the paper brings up is public perception. There's a lot of distrust and fear around AVs right now. Remember that AAA survey we talked about? Most Americans are still hesitant.
Well, it makes sense, doesn't it? It's a big unknown, especially when it comes to something as important as transportation. How do we address those fears and build some trust?
Transparency is huge. The paper emphasizes that manufacturers need to be more upfront about how these systems actually work. Explain the decision-making. Be clear about data collection. Address any potential biases. Be open about it.
It's not just about building the tech, it's about building trust with people, showing them we're not just blindly handing over control.
Right. And the paper suggests getting the public involved early on, holding open forums, doing surveys, getting feedback from different communities. It's about building a shared vision, not just imposing a solution.
Making sure everyone has a voice in how this all unfolds. It's a massive undertaking. So many different pieces to this puzzle. How do we manage it all? The tech side, the societal impact.
Collaboration is key. The paper stresses that. Bringing together experts from all kinds of fields, engineers, policymakers, ethicists, social scientists, all working towards the same goal.
It's about more than just the technology. It's about the human element.
Absolutely. And the paper sums it up really well with this quote, "Technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. It's how we design it, regulate it, and use it that really determines its impact."
We have the power to shape this technology, to steer it in a direction that benefits us all. But it
Mhm.
takes effort, a willingness to work together and learn from each other, a shared vision.
And that's where we're heading next, exploring the potential paths forward. Specific initiatives, concrete ideas that could help us navigate towards a responsible future with autonomous vehicles.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential, the challenges, lots of big questions. But let's shift gears a bit now. What about solutions? What's being done to actually shape the positive future for AVs?
Well, the paper we've been looking at points to some encouraging developments. For example, there are organizations like the IE. That's a big group for engineers, right? They're taking a proactive approach to these ethical questions we've been talking about.
I'm interested to hear more about that. What exactly is the IE doing?
They've created this framework called ethically aligned design. It's about making sure human well-being is at the center of how we design and develop these systems. Thinking about transparency, accountability, avoiding harmful bias in AI. It's a really comprehensive approach.
So it's not just building the tech, it's making sure it aligns with our values as humans. Are there companies actually using this framework in the real world?
Yeah, actually there are. A number of companies are incorporating these ethically aligned design principles into their AV development processes. They're focused on creating systems that are safe, fair, and explainable. Like some companies are putting a lot of emphasis on testing to make sure their AVs can handle all kinds of scenarios ethically.
That's good to hear. It seems like the industry is starting to get serious about responsible innovation. But what about the role of governments, policymakers? What can they do to help shape this future?
Regulation is key. The paper really emphasizes that. We talked about it earlier, but it's worth repeating. A messy patchwork of regulations could really slow things down, create confusion, and stifle innovation.
So a more unified approach,
Right.
balancing safety with the need to keep pushing the tech forward. Are there any good examples of governments doing this well?
Yeah, Germany's a good example. They created an ethics commission on automated driving that came up with these really comprehensive guidelines for AV development and deployment. One of the big takeaways was human life should never be negotiable.
It seems like a pretty fundamental principle, prioritizing human safety above all else. What about other parts of the world? Any other notable efforts?
The EU is another interesting example. They're using GDPR, their data protection law, to address privacy concerns with AVs. And they're also working on setting up clear rules about liability. You know, who's responsible if there's an accident with an autonomous vehicle?
It's like trying to create a whole new legal framework that can keep up with how quickly this tech is evolving, making sure we have the right rules in place for this new era of transportation.
Exactly. And it's not just governments and companies that have a role to play. The paper really stresses public engagement, too. We need to move past the fear and distrust and get people involved in a more meaningful way.
Yeah, help people understand this technology, how it might affect them. How can we do that better?
Well, the paper suggests things like open forums, community dialogues, places where people can learn, ask questions, share their concerns, get feedback from a wide range of people.
So democratizing the conversation a bit, making sure everyone's voice is heard as we figure this out.
Yeah.
It really comes down to this, doesn't it? Making sure this technology serves us, not the other way around.
Well said. That's really what it's all about. As we wrap up our deep dive into autonomous vehicles, we hope you'll keep exploring this, keep the conversation going, ask questions, stay informed about how things are developing. It's an exciting field, and it's changing fast.
It's a journey we're all on together. There's a lot we don't know yet. But if we work together, prioritize human values, I think we can create a future where AVs make our lives better, a more just and sustainable world.